The wind screamed across the Alaskan tundra with a fury that seemed almost personal, hurling ice crystals against the tiny research station with such force that the reinforced metal walls groaned and buckled. 23-year-old Jamie Patterson pressed her gloved hand against the frosted window, watching the whiteness beyond swallow everything. The generator shed barely 30 feet away, the emergency beacon tower, the horizon, even the difference between sky and ground. She'd arrived at Kaktovik Research Station 4 days ago, her first real assignment as a wildlife photographer for National Geographic's Emerging Talent Program, armed with $10,000 worth of camera equipment, 3 years of formal training, and dreams bigger than her actual experience in extreme conditions. Now, as the polar night descended, like a blanket being pulled over the entire Arctic, and temperatures plummeted to 43 degrees below zero, those dreams felt as distant and unreachable as the sun she wouldn't see again for the next 67 days. The station coordinator, a grizzled veteran of 14 Arctic winters named Dale Hutchinson, had warned her extensively about the severity of conditions this far north during his mandatory safety briefing on her first morning. His weathered face, lined with decades of squinting against snow glare and frozen wind, had been deadly serious as he'd walked her through emergency protocols. "This isn't some camping trip in the Rockies or even Alaska's interior," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "Up here, above the Arctic Circle, nature doesn't give second chances, doesn't offer do-overs, doesn't care about your preparation or your confidence." Jamie had nodded politely and attentively, absorbing the information, but privately confident in her own preparation, in the extensive research she'd conducted, in the survival courses she'd completed in Washington state over the past 2 years. She'd photographed grizzly bears in Yellowstone during spring emergence, weathered severe electrical storms in the Cascade Range, and spent an entire winter documenting wolf-pack dynamics in northern Montana, where temperatures regularly dropped below zero. How fundamentally different could the Arctic really be? She was about to learn the answer in the most terrifying way possible. If you're enjoying this story of survival against impossible odds, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your support helps us bring more incredible true stories of human resilience and determination to viewers everywhere. The answer to her question came with terrifying swiftness and brutal clarity. On her second full morning at the station, just as the sun was making its brief appearance above the horizon, a wan, pale disk that would grow smaller each day until it vanished entirely, Dale had taken the station's only functioning snowmobile to check on a series of automated weather monitoring stations scattered across the ice field in a wide arc. It was routine maintenance he'd completed literally hundreds of times over the years, a simple circuit that should have taken no more than 4 hours in decent conditions. He was supposed to radio in every hour and return by early afternoon at the latest. When the sun set at 2:15 p.m., painting the sky in shades of purple and deep blue that would have been breathtaking under any other circumstances, and Dale hadn't radioed in for over 3 hours, Jamie felt the first flutter of real worry in her chest. By midnight, with winds gusting to 73 miles per hour according to the anemometer, and the temperature dropping steadily toward -45, she knew with absolute certainty that something had gone catastrophically, terribly wrong. The storm had materialized seemingly out of nowhere, defying the weather predictions that had called for clear conditions, and it had done so with the kind of violent intensity that only Arctic systems could generate. She tried the radio every 15 minutes with increasing desperation, her voice growing more strained and frightened with each unanswered call that disappeared into static. "Kaktovik Station to Field Unit 1. Come in, Dale. Please respond. Over." Only crackling static answered, punctuated by the shrieking of wind that seemed to mock her growing panic and helplessness. The station's emergency protocols were absolutely clear on this point. In whiteout conditions, with visibility under 50 feet, Nobody goes outside for any reason. Nobody attempts solo rescue operations. Nobody takes unnecessary risks. The protocol was to wait for the storm to pass, maintain the station, and then contact the main research facility in Utqiagvik, roughly 23 miles to the northeast, across sea ice and frozen tundra. But the storm showed absolutely no signs of passing or even diminishing. The long-range communication system, which should have allowed her to call for help, had failed catastrophically 12 hours earlier when the main antenna was likely torn away by wind gusts that peaked at over 80 miles per hour. Jamie spent that first endless night inventorying the station's supplies with obsessive detail, forcing herself to think methodically and logically despite the fear that clawed at her throat and made her hands shake. She moved through the station with her flashlight, checking and rechecking, counting and recording everything. The main building was compact and efficient, a combination living quarters, laboratory space, and storage area, no bigger than a modest two-car garage. Dale had stocked it carefully for 2 people for 6 weeks of operation. 42 freeze-dried meal packets, 30 cans of various soups and vegetables, water purification tablets sufficient for 3 months, a comprehensive medical kit, and fuel for the diesel generator that should have lasted 8 weeks with normal usage. The generator itself sat in a separate insulated shed 30 feet from the main building, connected by a covered walkway that was now buried under more than 3 feet of densely packed snow. She had electric light powered by the generator, heat from both the main system and a backup propane heater, and enough food to last well beyond when help should arrive. She would survive until the storm broke and rescue teams could reach her. She had to believe that. But on the 3rd day of the storm, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, when the darkness outside was absolute and complete, the generator coughed once, sputtered, made a grinding sound that spoke of mechanical failure, and died completely. Jamie stood in the sudden, shocking silence, her breath immediately visible in clouds as the temperature inside the station began its inexorable drop toward equilibrium with the frozen hell outside. She grabbed her brightest flashlight and fought her way through the snow-choked walkway to the generator shed, ice crystals stinging and burning any millimeter of exposed skin, despite her balaclava, goggles, and multiple layers of protective clothing. The diesel fuel tank showed 3/4 full, which should have been more than sufficient. All the connections looked solid and secure. No obvious signs of damage or disconnection, but when she tried the manual start procedure, pulling the cord with all her strength, nothing happened at all. Again and again, she pulled that starter cord until her arms ached and trembled with exhaustion, until sweat froze on her forehead beneath the balaclava, and her lungs burned from gasping the brutally cold air. But the engine refused to turn over or show any sign of life. She checked everything she could think of with her limited mechanical knowledge: fuel lines, filters, the battery connections for the electric start. But whatever had failed was beyond her ability to diagnose or repair. After 45 minutes in the generator shed, with her fingers and toes starting to go numb, despite her insulated boots and gloves, she was forced to retreat back to the main building. Back inside, she assessed her drastically changed reality with the same methodical, detail-oriented approach she used when setting up complex photographic shoots in challenging conditions. No generator meant no electric heat, which was the primary warming system for the entire station. It meant no lights beyond her 2 flashlights and the LED panel on her camera, all of which had limited battery life in extreme cold. It meant no way to melt snow for drinking water except over an open flame, and no way to heat food except the same method. The station had a backup propane heater that Dale had shown her on the first day, but he'd mentioned in passing that it was temperamental and the propane supply was limited, maybe 2 weeks of continuous operation if she burned it 24 hours a day, considerably less if the storm kept temperatures at their current deadly levels. Her phone, which had been fully charged when the power died, would last perhaps 2 more days in these conditions before the cold killed the battery completely. Her camera batteries, crucial for documenting her situation and any rescue attempts, would fare even worse in the extreme cold, losing charge rapidly even when not in use. She thought of her mother in Seattle, who'd begged her repeatedly not to take this assignment, who'd argued that Jamie was talented enough to work anywhere without risking her life. "You could photograph weddings, commercial work, anything," her mother had pleaded. "Why do you have to go to the ends of the earth?" Jamie had laughed it off at the time, determined to prove herself, to capture images that would launch her career into the stratosphere. Now her mother's prescient words echoed in the growing darkness as she lit the propane heater and felt its meager warmth begin to push back feebly against the encroaching cold that pressed in from every direction. The heater's flame danced and flickered, and Jamie found herself staring at it hypnotically, trying not to think about what would happen when the propane ran out. The temperature inside the station had already dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was falling steadily. Outside, the thermometer read -47, and the wind chill drove the effective temperature far lower. The first week blurred into a grueling routine of desperate efficiency and constant calculation. Jamie learned, through painful trial and error, to ration the propane with miserly precision, running the heater only 4 hours each day, 2 hours in the morning starting at 6 a.m. to thaw her frozen limbs enough to move without injury, and 2 hours in the evening starting at 6 p.m. to warm her core temperature enough to achieve something resembling sleep. Between those warming periods, she wore every piece of clothing she'd brought, multiple layers that made movement awkward, but kept her core temperature just barely above hypothermic levels. She melted snow for drinking water in a large metal pot balanced precariously over 3 candles at a time from the station's emergency supply, which she'd counted obsessively. 47 candles total, each one capable of burning for approximately 4 hours. She did the math repeatedly, checking and rechecking her calculations. At 9 candles per day for water melting, she had just over 5 days of candle supply. She would have to reduce that somehow, ration even more carefully. The freeze-dried meals, which were designed to be reconstituted with boiling water, required heat energy she simply couldn't afford to expend. Instead, she ate them barely rehydrated with cold water, chewing the crunchy, unpalatable results and washing them down with ice-cold water that made her teeth ache and her stomach cramp. Outside, the storm raged on with apocalyptic fury that seemed biblical in its intensity. The polar night meant 24 hours of absolute darkness, broken only by occasional brief periods when the blizzard thinned just enough to reveal stars that seemed to pulse with cold fire overhead, distant and utterly indifferent to her suffering. During one of these temporary lulls on the 5th day, Jamie suited up in every layer she owned: thermal underwear, fleece, down jacket, windproof shell, insulated snow pants, 2 pairs of gloves, balaclava, goggles, and fought her way through hip-deep snowdrifts to the emergency beacon tower. She found it encased in nearly 3 inches of solid, clear ice, the access panel frozen completely shut despite her best efforts with a metal pry bar from the toolkit. She chipped at the ice for 20 minutes, making almost no progress, while frostbite threatened her fingers even through 2 layers of insulated gloves. Finally, with her hands going numb and her core temperature dropping dangerously, she was forced to retreat back inside, defeated and increasingly desperate. That night, huddled under every blanket in the station, while the propane heater clicked and hissed in the corner, consuming her precious fuel supply, Jamie faced the mathematical reality that terrified her more than anything else. The propane would run out in 9 more days, maybe 10 if she cut her usage back to just 3 hours daily and accepted being even colder. The candles would last perhaps 3 weeks at her current rate of consumption if she was very careful and very lucky. But without the propane heater, the interior temperature would drop rapidly to match the exterior temperature, 50 below zero or worse, with no protection except her clothing and blankets. No human being could survive that for long, not even with the best cold weather gear. She needed another heat source, something sustainable that would burn longer and produce more heat than candles alone could provide. She thought back to a documentary project she'd assisted on 2 years ago, a piece about traditional Inuit communities in northern Canada. She remembered watching an elder woman demonstrate survival techniques that had been passed down through countless generations, including the process of rendering seal blubber into oil that burned clean and hot in traditional stone lamps called quillik. The old woman had explained that a single seal could provide enough oil to keep a family warm for weeks during the darkest part of winter. At the time, Jamie had found it fascinating from an anthropological perspective, but never imagined she'd need to apply the knowledge herself. The station's freezers, now unpowered but maintaining their frozen state through the sheer ambient cold, held Dale's research specimens. 3 ringed seals he'd collected for tissue analysis before they were scheduled to be shipped south to the university in Fairbanks. She'd walked past them dozens of times without really registering their presence, frozen solid in thick plastic bags, just another piece of research infrastructure. Now she looked at them with different eyes, seeing not scientific specimens, but potential survival tools, a possible path to staying alive long enough for rescue. The idea seemed insane at first, almost laughably impractical. She was a photographer from Spokane, Washington, not a survival expert or Arctic indigenous person with generations of traditional knowledge. She'd never butchered anything larger than a fish at a summer camp when she was 14. She had no idea if she could actually make this work, if the process would yield usable oil, if she could stomach the gruesome work required. But as the propane heater clicked off at the end of her evening warming period and the cold rushed back in like a physical presence, pressing against her skin and seeping into her bones, Jamie realized with absolute clarity that she had no choice whatsoever. Dale might be dead somewhere out on the ice, frozen in his emergency shelter or buried under snow. Help couldn't reach her until the storm cleared, and meteorological patterns in the Arctic could maintain systems like this for weeks. She was completely alone in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, and if she wanted to live, if she wanted any chance of seeing her family again, she needed to adapt using whatever resources were available. The seals represented heat, light, and survival. She would learn to use them. The next morning, working by the combined light of a flashlight and her camera's LED panel to conserve the precious candles, Jamie hauled the first seal specimen from the freezer with effort that left her breathing hard in the thin, cold air. It was smaller than she'd expected based on her limited knowledge of Arctic wildlife, maybe 4 feet long from nose to tail, its sleek body covered in spotted grey fur, its dark eyes frozen in a permanent glassy stare that seemed to judge her. She'd researched the rendering process extensively on her phone while she still had battery life, downloading every survival article, traditional knowledge resource, and instructional video she could find before the power failed. The key to the entire process was the blubber layer beneath the skin, a thick white layer of fat, rich in oils that would render into fuel suitable for burning in improvised lamps. She needed sharp tools, infinite patience, and a strong stomach to overcome the revulsion she already felt at what she was about to do. Using Dale's dissection kit from the laboratory, sterile scalpels and knives designed for precise scientific work, Jamie began the gruesome task that would determine whether she lived or died. The seal's hide was frozen iron-hard, solid as wood, and nearly impossible to cut. She had to wait hours for the body to thaw enough in the relatively warmer interior of the station, bringing the temperature of the flesh up from perhaps -40 to maybe 10 degrees before she could even pierce the skin. When she finally managed to make the first cut, her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the scalpel. The blade bit into the tough hide, and she had to saw back and forth, applying far more pressure than she'd anticipated to make any progress at all. But she forced herself to continue, peeling back sections of blubber with the methodical focus and attention to detail she usually reserved for adjusting camera settings and composition in the field. The fat layer was surprisingly thick, over an inch in places, pure white with a slightly translucent quality. She cut it carefully into chunks roughly the size of ice cubes, placing them in the largest metal pot from the station's kitchen supplies. The smell was overwhelming even in the cold. Fishy, oily, wild, carrying the scent of the sea and something else indefinable. But she worked through it, breathing through her mouth and focusing on the task at hand. The rendering process took 2 full days of patient, careful work that tested her determination and resourcefulness. She had to heat the blubber slowly and gently over candle flame, using 3 candles at once to generate sufficient heat, letting the fat gradually melt away from the connective tissue and small skin fragments that clung to it. She couldn't let it boil or burn, which would ruin the oil and waste precious resources. The liquid that gradually accumulated was clear and golden, surprisingly beautiful, smelling powerfully of the sea and fish and something ancient and primal. Jamie poured the rendered oil carefully into empty tin cans from the kitchen supplies, creating makeshift lamps with braided cotton wicks she'd pulled from her spare t-shirts, twisting the fabric tightly and securing it in the oil. When she lit the first lamp with trembling hands, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear that it wouldn't work, the flame caught immediately and held steady, burning with a warm, bright light that seemed like a genuine miracle in the darkness of her survival situation. The flame was surprisingly clean, with minimal smoke, and it produced both illumination and heat, blessed warmth that she could feel on her face, even from a foot away. The seal oil lamps changed everything about her situation and her chances of survival. Each lamp burned for 8 to 10 hours on a single fill, producing both light to see by and heat far more efficiently than candles alone. Jamie set up 3 lamps around the main living area in a triangular pattern, creating a small zone of relative warmth where the temperature hovered around 18 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, still well below freezing, still dangerously cold by normal standards, but survivable, with enough layers and far better than the -40 outside. She could feel her body beginning to adjust to the extreme conditions, growing more efficient at conserving heat, her metabolism slowing to match the drastically reduced calorie intake as she carefully stretched her food supply. But the physical isolation was rapidly becoming its own kind of enemy, perhaps more dangerous than the cold itself. 2 weeks into her ordeal, Jamie started talking to herself constantly, narrating her actions out loud, like she was filming a documentary for an invisible audience. "Now we're going to check the wind speed and direction," she'd say to the empty room, her voice sounding strange and hollow in the confined space, pulling back the insulated curtain to peer at the anemometer barely visible through the blowing snow outside. Still gusting to 62 miles per hour from the northeast. No change from yesterday or the day before. The system is stalled over us. Sometimes she pretended to conduct interviews with herself, asking questions about her work, her childhood in Washington, her relationship with her parents, her dreams and ambitions, anything to fill the oppressive silence that pressed against her ears like physical weight and made her feel like the last person alive on Earth. She talked about her first camera, a gift from her grandfather when she was 12. She talked about the teacher in high school who'd encouraged her artistic vision. She talked about everything and nothing, just to hear a human voice, even if it was only her own, echoing back from the metal walls. She thought constantly about her ex-boyfriend, Liam, who'd broken up with her 6 months ago because, in his words, he couldn't handle her level of ambition and her willingness to sacrifice everything for her career. "You care more about getting the perfect shot than you do about us, about building a life together," he'd said during their final argument. "You're always leaving, always chasing the next assignment, the next adventure. I can't compete with that. Maybe he'd been right, she thought now. Maybe her single-minded focus on career advancement had cost her something important. She thought about her college roommate, Brianna, who'd gotten married last spring in a beautiful ceremony in Portland that Jamie had skipped, choosing instead to photograph bird migration patterns in the Everglades for a regional magazine. Brianna had been hurt, though she'd tried to hide it, and their friendship had cooled considerably since then. Jamie thought about all the choices she'd made, the relationships she'd deprioritized, the experiences she'd missed, all in pursuit of the career that had led her here. Alone in the darkness, burning seal fat to stay alive, while the wind howled its endless song of desolation outside. On day 16, when she'd almost given up hope that conditions would ever change, the storm finally broke. Jamie woke from fitful sleep to a silence so profound and absolute, it seemed impossible, almost frightening in its completeness after weeks of constant wind. No howling gale, no snow pelting the walls like handfuls of thrown gravel, no vibration of the building under assault, just absolute quiet under a sky scattered with more stars than she'd ever seen in her entire life. The aurora borealis danced and rippled overhead in spectacular ribbons of green and violet and blue, so achingly beautiful it made her cry for the first time since the generator had failed, tears freezing on her cheeks almost instantly. She grabbed her primary camera with shaking hands, suddenly desperate to document this moment, to capture this incredible display, to prove to herself that beauty and wonder still existed even in the midst of desperate survival. But when she tried to power on the camera, pressing the button repeatedly, nothing happened at all. The battery was completely dead, frozen solid, despite her best efforts to keep it warm against her body. All her backup batteries were similarly useless, robbed of their charge by the relentless cold that had pervaded everything. Jamie stood in the doorway of the station, staring at the useless equipment that represented her entire career, her purpose for being in this God-forsaken place, her professional identity. Then, surprisingly, she started to laugh, a slightly hysterical sound that echoed across the empty ice field and disappeared into the vast darkness. She'd survived more than 2 weeks in some of the most extreme conditions on Earth through ingenuity, determination, and resourcefulness, and now she couldn't even take a single photograph to document or prove what she'd endured. The irony was almost too perfect, too absurd to be believed. The clear weather represented her best and perhaps only chance to attempt reaching Utqiagvik on foot, 23 miles across sea ice and frozen tundra, in temperatures that still hovered around -32, according to the exterior thermometer. It would be extremely dangerous, possibly suicidal, she knew that with absolute certainty. But staying indefinitely at the station meant eventually running out of food. She had maybe 10 days of rations remaining. And while the seal oil would last another week or two, what would she do after rendering all 3 seals? How long could she sustain herself on this razor's edge between survival and death, balanced precariously between freezing and starving? She was still wrestling seriously with this impossible decision, weighing the risks of staying versus traveling, when she saw the lights approaching across the ice field. At first, Jamie genuinely thought the aurora had descended somehow to ground level, that her oxygen-deprived brain was playing tricks on her. The lights bobbed and weaved across the ice field in patterns that seemed almost random. Then she heard the distant, beautiful growl of engines, snowmobiles, at least 3 of them, maybe more, headed directly toward the research station. She stumbled outside without bothering to put on her outer layers, waving both arms frantically overhead and shouting at the top of her lungs, even though they couldn't possibly hear her yet, over the engine noise. The lights grew steadily closer, and she could make out bundled shapes astride the machines, and then voices calling her name across the ice, and she was shouting back, screaming really, releasing weeks of pent-up fear and loneliness and desperation. The rescue team from Utqiagvik had been actively searching for 3 solid days, ever since the massive storm system finally cleared enough to allow safe travel across the ice. They'd found Dale first, hypothermic but miraculously alive in an emergency bivouac shelter where he'd taken refuge when his snowmobile suffered catastrophic mechanical failure and he'd crashed. He'd fractured his left leg badly in the accident and couldn't walk or travel. But he'd managed to survive by building a proper snow cave, using techniques he'd learned over his years in the Arctic, and rationing his emergency supplies with the same careful discipline he'd tried to teach Jamie. The moment he was stable enough to communicate coherently with his rescuers, he'd told them urgently about Jamie, alone and stranded at the station without power, and they'd mounted an immediate rescue operation despite the lingering dangerous conditions. The team leader, a woman named Patricia Rivera, with kind, intelligent eyes and 30 years of Arctic search and rescue experience etched into her weathered face, wrapped Jamie immediately in a thermal blanket and checked her systematically for frostbite, hypothermia, and other cold-related injuries. "You did incredibly well, kid," she said, her voice rough with genuine emotion and professional respect. "Dale told us about the generator failure when we found him. When we got close enough to see the seal oil lamps burning in the windows, we knew you'd figured it out somehow. That's old-school traditional survival knowledge right there. Most people your age wouldn't have even thought of it, let alone made it work." As they carefully loaded her onto a rescue sled for the long journey back to Utqiagvik, securing her with straps and surrounding her with chemical heat packs, Jamie looked back one final time at the research station, her prison and sanctuary for the past 18 desperate days. The seal oil lamps still flickered steadily in the windows, golden points of light against the vast, indifferent darkness of the Arctic night. She'd come to Alaska to photograph wildlife, to capture stunning images of polar beauty and power that would define and launch her career into the upper echelons of nature photography. Instead, she'd learned something far more fundamental and valuable: the raw, primal truth of survival, the incredible human capacity to adapt and endure when everything else falls away and only the will to live remains. She'd learned that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, more resourceful than she'd given herself credit for, more resilient than her mother's fears or her ex-boyfriend's doubts had suggested. She'd learned that survival wasn't about the equipment you carried or the training you'd completed. It was about the decisions you made, moment by moment, when failure meant death. In the small but well-equipped hospital at Utqiagvik, doctors treated her for minor frostbite on 3 toes of her left foot and moderate dehydration, despite her efforts to maintain fluid intake. She'd lost 14 pounds from her already slim frame, and the medical staff explained that her body would need several weeks of rest and proper nutrition to fully recover from the extended ordeal. But she'd survived, and more importantly, she'd fundamentally transformed her understanding of herself. She wasn't just a photographer chasing the perfect shot anymore. She was someone who could face truly impossible odds and find a way through, someone who could adapt and overcome. Dale visited her the next afternoon, hobbling into her room on crutches with his left leg encased in a walking cast. "I'm so sorry, Jamie," he said immediately, his weathered face showing genuine remorse and guilt. "I should have postponed that maintenance run, should have waited for better conditions. The storm warning said the system would pass well south of us, but Arctic weather doesn't follow predictions or respect forecasts. It does what it wants." "You couldn't have known the forecast would be wrong," Jamie replied, meaning it sincerely. "And you survived too, using the same knowledge and skills you tried to teach me. That's what matters in the end. We both made it through." "Eddie." He nodded slowly, then pulled something from inside his heavy jacket, a small plastic bag containing a micro SD card. "I found this when I went back to check the station with the rescue team," he explained. It's from the security camera system, the one that's battery-powered for emergencies. It's got footage from the whole time you were alone there, everything you did to survive. I thought maybe you'd want it. As evidence or closure or documentation or whatever you need it to be. Jamie took the card carefully, feeling its negligible weight in her palm. Later, when she was stronger and had access to a computer, she would watch that footage and see herself transformed by pure necessity, a young, ambitious photographer becoming something harder, more resilient, more fundamentally capable than she'd ever been before. She would see herself render seal blubber with trembling, uncertain hands, see herself talk to the darkness to keep the crushing loneliness at bay, see herself survive moment by moment when giving up would have been so much easier than continuing to fight. 6 months later, after extensive physical recovery and even more extensive reflection, Jamie published a long-form article in National Geographic titled 3 Weeks in the Polar Night, a photographer's survival story. It wasn't accompanied by the stunning wildlife photographs she'd originally traveled to Alaska to capture, the images of polar bears and Arctic foxes that were supposed to make her reputation. Instead, it featured stark, compelling images pulled from the security footage, black and white stills that showed the raw, unfiltered reality of Arctic survival in ways that polished professional photographs never could. The piece went viral almost immediately, shared millions of times across social media platforms and sparking intense conversations about preparation, resilience, the value of traditional indigenous knowledge, and the techniques that Arctic peoples had used for millennia to not just survive, but thrive in extreme environments that would kill most people within hours. She received offers from literally dozens of major publications, invitations to speak at survival conferences and university programs, even a substantial book deal from a major publisher who wanted her to expand the story into a full memoir. But Jamie turned down most of these opportunities, declining the speaking fees and the book advance and the documentary proposals. She'd learned through her ordeal that the best and most important stories weren't always the ones you carefully planned to tell. Sometimes they were the ones that found you unexpectedly in the darkness and forced you to become someone stronger, someone different, someone more than you'd ever imagined you could be. She didn't want to build a career on trauma or turn her survival into entertainment. She did accept one specific assignment, though. A year-long documentary project working directly with Inuit elders in communities across northern Alaska, learning and meticulously recording traditional survival techniques for a new generation that was increasingly disconnected from ancestral knowledge. She owed her life to knowledge that had been passed down through countless centuries of Arctic living, and she wanted to honor that profound debt by helping to preserve and share it. It felt like the right way forward, the meaningful path her experience had prepared her for. On her first day of filming for the new project, working alongside a grandmother named Aluk, who'd spent 73 years living on the ice and teaching traditional ways, Jamie watched the elderly woman render seal blubber with practiced economical movements that spoke of a lifetime of expertise. The elder looked up from her work and smiled warmly, seeing recognition and understanding in the young photographer's eyes that hadn't been there before. "You've done this before," she said simply. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. "Yes," Jamie replied quietly, honestly. "Once. When I had absolutely no other choice but to learn or die." The grandmother nodded with evident approval, her weathered hands never pausing in their work. "That's when you truly learn who you really are, when there's no choice left but to survive, when all the easy options are gone. The ice teaches us this truth. The long night teaches us this truth. You learned well, granddaughter. The knowledge recognized you as worthy." "Bree." As Jamie raised her camera to capture the woman's weathered, capable hands working the blubber with generations of accumulated skill, she felt something fundamental settle into place inside her, a deep understanding that her time trapped in the research station hadn't been a tragic deviation from her carefully planned path as a photographer. It had been the crucible moment when her true path began, the transformative experience that taught her to see not just with her trained eyes, but with her whole being, forged by cold and darkness and the fierce determination to keep the light burning against impossible odds. The aurora borealis rippled overhead that night in spectacular displays of green and gold and violet, painting the ice and snow in colors that seemed almost supernatural. Jamie photographed it extensively, with equipment that worked properly in the cold, using batteries she kept warm against her body in the traditional way the grandmother had taught her. But even as she framed the perfect shots and adjusted her settings for optimal exposure, she remembered clearly those 18 days when she'd had no working camera, when survival itself was the only art that mattered, the only skill worth developing. She'd gone into the Arctic darkness as a photographer, seeking to make her mark. She'd emerged from that darkness as a survivor who understood her own strength, and in the end, she realized, those weren't separate identities at all. They were two complementary sides of the same fundamental determination to witness, to endure, to document, and to carry light into even the deepest darkness that life could conjure.